Director Kapoor, thank you so much for joining us
Sure.
at the Gateway of India Dialogue. How has Africa fared as a strategically arranged economic bloc?
I mean, I think to be a strategic bloc is an aspiration for Africa. They are not really an economic bloc right now. In fact, if you look at the continent as a whole, the percentage of trade within the region is among the lowest in the world. Only about 15% of African trade takes place with other African countries. In the case of Asia, it's more like 50%. So, as a bloc, very little economic activity goes on within African countries. And the reasons are not difficult to find. I mean, you've got huge infrastructure challenges. People tend to talk about Africa as one entity, but it's actually 54 countries, each with its own rules, regulations, customs procedures, which are not harmonized. Within Africa, there are certain parts of the continent which are doing a better job of integrating themselves and acting like a bloc. I think the East African community is one. But I think increasing efforts are being made by the political leadership. But so far, at least in my own sense, anytime there is a discussion about integration and acting as a region rather than as an individual country, the politics comes in and there's a preference to act nationally rather than regionally. So I think while many political leaders look at the European Union and say this is a system that we need to emulate, it hasn't quite worked out now. But there are one or two things that have happened which are quite encouraging. So some countries, for example, have now enacted visa-free movement of labor for other Africans. So if you're an African, you don't need a visa. So the flow of labor is improving. So that's one example of Africa coming together as operating as a bloc. Within East Africa, there are harmonized customs procedures. The energy grid operates. You can. It doesn't matter where you generate the electricity. You can sell it on a grid. So the energy sector is operating like a bloc. So I guess what I'm saying is there are examples of Africa operating like a bloc, but as a whole, there's still a long way to go.
Right. However, there has been a fair transformation in the kind of economies and the growth that African economies have gone through. And how has the work of the African Development Bank contributed to that? And what are the kind of the sectors and the countries that the bank is really focused on right now?
I think probably the single most important sector that we are focusing now is on energy. I think Africa overall has an electrification rate of less than 30%. There are some countries in Africa where the average African consumes 100 kilowatt hours per year. To compare that to the US, which is 13,000 kilowatt hours per year. In Europe, it's about 7,000 kilowatt hours per year. So there's a huge energy deficit. And what the leaders in Africa are telling us and what the population in Africa is telling us is unless you satisfy energy needs, you really can't satisfy anything else, because the lack of energy doesn't allow you to create jobs. You can't run factories, you can't run businesses, health outcomes are compromised, education outcomes are compromised. So I think energy is probably the single biggest area. We estimate that will require something like $60 to $90 billion a year. That's a lot of resources. If you take the Sustainable Development Goal target, which is universal access to energy for Africa by 2030, this will require something like 160 gigawatts of new power, connecting about 215 million homes, which is a large undertaking, but it's something that we are committed to doing. The second area, I think, is feeding Africa. I mean, it might sound like a cliche, but Africa has about 60% of the world's arable land, and yet imports food. In 2015, Africa's net food imports amounted to $35 billion. And we estimate that if this thing continues unchecked, by in the next 20 years, Africa will be importing net $100 billion worth of food. Africa should actually be a net exporter of food given plentiful arable land, water resources. And the real problem there is that productivity is very low. So for most commodities, Africa produces maybe 10 or 15% of the global best practice, whether it's wheat or rice or soya or sorghum. And actually 15 commodities roughly account for the vast majority of these imports. So our second priority is to try and get productivity rates up so that Africa becomes a net food exporter in the next 20 years rather than an importer. So I'd say those are the two. And of course, we do a lot of work in the area of transport, railways, roads, airports, ports. Africa has a huge middle class, about $2 trillion in purchasing power. And with all of that comes the sorts of things the middle class needs. So we have operations across a wide range of sectors. But if I had to prioritize just two, it'd be energy and agriculture.
Right. I'm glad that you brought up agriculture because, like you said, it's a major part of the SDGs, and a lot of new goals have been set for the targets that Africa has to reach.
Yes.
So how did these ideas come together? The idea of global food security, like you spoke about, as well as the idea of sustainable development and sustainable energy practices.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, if you look at all the SDGs together, they represent a very ambitious agenda compared to the predecessors, the Millennium Development Goals. I mean, the SDGs are a much more comprehensive set of goals, which actually many world leaders appreciate more. The Millennium Development Goals are focused much more on the social sectors. SDGs look at energy, transport, health, education, employment. So they're much more grounded in development. But at the same time, I mean, the big challenge to bring all of these SDGs together is the huge financing needs. There are estimates that say for developing economies, the needs are anywhere between $5 and $6 trillion, and only half that, or less than half that, is being invested. So the question is, where is the rest of this money going to come from? And so increasingly the discussion is whether it's the energy sector, whether it's the agricultural sector, whether it's infrastructure, much of the money will need to come from the private sector. Now the challenge we have is that in many parts of not just Africa but in the world, the private sector is concerned about the risks associated with investing, and particularly if you're a fragile economy, if you're a post-conflict economy. And so among the multilateral development banks like the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the African Development Bank, we're having a conversation which says what should be our role to try to bring in private investment into these areas. So if Africa is to meet its SDG on energy or on agriculture, etc. On agriculture, it will take about $30 billion a year. Energy between 60 and $90 billion a year. Those sums of money are not something that the multilateral development banks have. You could combine all the multilateral banks, all the bilateral banks, you wouldn't come up with those resources. So it has to be tax money, it has to be private sector investment, and then of course some money from the multilateral banks. So we are working a lot on guarantees, developing risk instruments, and telling the private sector, right, here's a great energy project, we will put a small amount of money in there, we will guarantee any loss that you might make as a result of government policy, political strife. You come in with your resources, and if we can guarantee your investment, why would you hesitate coming in? So we're trying to develop instruments which will make it attractive to de-risk any kind of investment. And it's a conversation that is difficult because what the private sector often wants is not something that governments are willing to give. Guarantees, for example, they're saying you're investing your capital, you're going to make the money, why should we have to guarantee it? But the fact of the matter is, unless the private sector gets those guarantees, they're not willing to come in. And if they're not going to come in, then all of these SDGs will not be met. So it's a conversation that we are beginning to have in the G20, particularly under the leadership of Germany starting next year, is looking very carefully at this issue, and we're working together to try and come up with something creative and innovative that will appeal to the private sector.